Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today I'm going to be covering the gold medal finals match at Revolution Rumble 2025 between Henry Reynolds and Zach Showalter. But before we start the fight, I have to talk a little bit about rule set because this tournament uses a slightly different rule set than most other tournaments. They have a right-of-way and a priority style system. What that means is that right-of-way means that the attacker gets priority. If you're the attacker and you land your hit, you get your point, even if you got hit back at the same time, which makes some people a little upset. But there are some perks to this rule set, and specifically the priority system that was added on top. This finals fight took 4 minutes and had 19 exchanges. So if there's any credit to be given to the rule set here, it allows for quite a lot of exchanges, quite a lot of fast judging, and most importantly, those two in combination means that this tournament got to have a double elimination bracket. So there was a lot of fights to be had, and if you wanted to go to this tournament or wanted to run a tournament yourself where you wanted to prioritize lots of fights, clean judging, and clean fencing in the sense that doubles are going to be resolved in some sort of way, well, you might have your answer. So first exchange, and it's not actually the first exchange. Again, with 19 exchanges, I'm going to have to cut a few of them out. We have a very interesting interaction here where Zach goes in for a little bit of a hand strike, and Henry capitalizes on this opportunity while essentially moving backwards at the same time to do a parry riposte by basically guarding it with his strong and then immediately throwing a Showalter down the pipe in between the line of Zach's sword and his body. You can say that fundamentally it's a kind of duplaren, although it doesn't follow a lot of the fundamental structure of the plays that involve duplaren, especially because essentially what this attack is you parried, you got your opponent off on the outside line by pushing them there, and then you're seizing the inside line with a follow-up attack that doesn't change lines. It's basically the concept of doubling here where you're throwing a defense and then an attack along the same area and getting behind your opponent's sword. But again, I think calling it duplaren maybe isn't the best descriptor. Either way, though, it is a very nice demonstration of this rule set here because as Zach is going forward, Henry is heavily incentivized to go backwards because if he's not the one moving forward first, he has no attack priority and a counterattack is significantly less likely to come out in his favor. In fact, it's impossible for it to come out in his favor. So he has to move backwards, he has to parry, but then the second he does, he has parry priority, which means that even after Henry had made his successful block, if Zach had managed to hit him at the exact same time, it was Henry who would have been guaranteed to get the point. So you can see how a right-of-way style of fencing is meant to disincentivize doubling fencing and disincentivize people who don't take the attacks of their opponents seriously. So for this next exchange, we have what many people would consider in other rule sets a very traditional double. But again, part of the point of a right-of-way rule set is to have resolution to doubles and to try to not have them happen as many times as you possibly can. So in this particular instance, what we have here is we have Zach basically walking Henry down into his corner of the ring, at which point Henry, who realizes that he's getting a little bit too close to the edge of his ring, decides to explode forward and try to seize on a similar sort of timing that he had in that previous exchange. He wants to wait for Zach to come forward, wait for him to miss that little bit, and then explode forward. But he didn't get the timing quite right on this one, and as a result, he exploded forward into an attack that was still incoming, which means, technically speaking, Zach on the left here is the one with the attack priority, and Henry on the right is the one with the counter attack, which means that attack keeps its priority and Zach gets his point. This is a very important interaction to understand if you're going to use or understand or judge this rule set, because what you have to basically keep in mind is that what is defined as a double in this concept is two people who attack by moving forward simultaneously, not necessarily people who hit simultaneously. Now, for this next exchange, and this is the last weird double I'm going to show, I promise, we have another interesting interaction because, as I mentioned earlier, this tournament also had a priority rule set, which means that there were different priorities assigned to different targets, and that priority could determine whether or not you kept your attack priority or whether or not you lost it. For example, in this particular exchange, we see a little bit of an exchange and then a reset, and then both fencers come forward and hit each other. And again, this fits the definition I mentioned earlier about a double really requiring that forward motion from both fencers. So Henry throws a little bit of a left overhow that looks like it hits at the lower part of the elbow, but the judges thought it hit into the torso. Meanwhile, Zach comes straight down the pipe and lands one onto the top of the head. Now this matters because in this rule set, all cuts to the body lost priority, meaning that if this was a double of a body and a head, despite the fact that Henry might have come forward at the exact same time, or even if Henry had been the initial attacker, because he had theoretically thrown a cut to the body, he would have lost all priority and Zach would have been awarded the point. During the judging of this particular exchange, the director tried to give Zach the point for this exact interaction, but then Zach basically told the judges, no, he actually hit me in the arm, and the arms were not considered a lower priority. This is another little difference that is important to understand, but maybe a little bit confusing. The concept here is that priority is not assigned to the part of the body that you think would be the most lethal or anything like that, or that should get you the most points and maybe another kind of rule set. It was based on how difficult it was to parry or how easy or perhaps incentivized it might be to use it as a target for doubling an afterblow. Think about a classic interaction where two people clash together and their swords and their hands go straight up into the air. Pulling your arms off and then throwing that middle how is basically impossible to parry as long as you know that when you do this, you're going to get hit somewhere else. The idea here is that by giving cuts to the body this lower priority, it was the intention of the rule set and of the tournament to make sure that some of the very common tactics that people use to double and afterblow their way to nullifying the score of their opponent would lose them priority and would lose them the point in these exchanges, again, even if they had the initial attack priority. Another target that had this feature was the legs. If you came in and did a one-handed or two-handed Geistling straight to the leg and you sacrificed everything for it and you got hit, it didn't matter whether you initiated the attack. It didn't matter if you parried first somehow. All that mattered was that you hit leg, you lost all your priority, and if you got hit back at all anywhere, except maybe to the body, you were going to lose your point. So now that we got the rule set discussion most of the way out of the way, we can talk about the really cool exchanges, and this definitely fits my definition. This is something that Zach is very, very good at, and he pulls off a lot in other tournaments and other rule sets, but one that almost got him into a little bit of a trouble here, but really paid off in the long term, and that was just his basic left plow thrust from cold open. And really, normally he uses these as a bit of a counterattack, which, like I said, could theoretically get you into trouble in this rule set because counterattacks generally lose priority. However, one of the key aspects of this particular kind of left plow thrust that Zach does is that he winds it up really, really high and through his center line. And this is very important because what that does is it keeps your flat horizontal crossguard in front of your hands kind of like as a shield, and it brushes all attacks that come through that center line off to the side, either left or right, depending on which side of the crossguard it hits. In this particular instance, Henry comes forward basically at the exact same time and throws a kind of Scheitelhau, a basic vertical cut straight down the pipe, but a little bit on the left side of the line. As a result, he glances off the crossguard of Zach as he comes forward and has pretty much all of his forward momentum with his blade arrested before it then comes to kind of lay on the top of his mask and on the top of his shoulder. The judges ruled that this attack was not quality enough because of how much of the crossguard it hit on the way in, and I frankly agree with them a little bit. If you're watching this without sound, it might seem like Zach comes forward, gets a nice stab, but basically gets conked right on the head. But if you listen very closely, you can hear the very distinct ring of the crossguard as Henry's blade comes in, and you know that it deflected off of something very, very metal as it came in, and then after it deflected, kind of just got pressed against the target. It was a really, really tight one to judge, but another great demonstration on how in a lot of ways, we like to think of deep targets as being these high-risk, high-reward maneuvers. But if you're very smart about how you present your attack, you can use the limited defensive, but the defensive capabilities of your longsword with its horizontal crossguard to essentially put up a simultaneous parry and thrust at the same time and come out with a really, really clean exchange. So for this next exchange, we have a really nice showcase of the skill set that Henry is bringing to the table in this fight, and that is his supreme mastery of distance and timing when it comes to getting people onto the defensive and then sniping them in the hands. Something that is of paramount importance in this very particular rule set, because of course, if you can get someone to start moving backwards, you can ensure that they can't counterattack you. And if you throw an attack that they have very much difficulty parrying, well, then you're probably going to hit those hands and you're going to come away with some very nice points. And that's exactly what Henry does here. He is very good at moving in when he's supposed to move in, moving out when he's supposed to move out, getting those very critical parries as he's moving backwards, and then capitalizing on a repost that utilizes some very clean, very tight, but not very dramatic footwork to get into range, snipe the target he needs to snipe, and then be in a perfect position to exit. And this is, in my mind, a great demonstration of clean hit and don't get hit fencing regardless of the rule set, but one that also takes full advantage of the intention of the right-of-way rule set to ensure that he's not just running in and trying to take advantage of attack priority every single time. He's also simultaneously using the advantage he gets when he gets to move backwards and parry to make sure that he is in a situation where he has forced his opponent into a corner from the rule set's perspective every single time he goes and engages. Now, of course, right after I get done describing how good Henry is at moving forward when he's supposed to move forward and moving backward when he's supposed to move backward, here we see a great demonstration of Zachary Showalter taking advantage of that pattern that he sees in Henry and baiting him into moving forward when he really shouldn't have. What Zach does here is he comes forward with a hand thrust, and a hand thrust is something that's going to get anybody to back up regardless of what situation you're in. However, the second Zach sees that Henry has backed up and attempted to parry the hand thrust, which you basically can't really do, he then waits for Henry to start to reset and take his little step forward in order to try to go for that classic repost that Henry is so known for, and immediately Dirch Vexels his blade underneath of where he expects that tapping parry to come from and stabs Henry in the chest. And really the only reason this can work is if you can bait your opponent into walking into measure without them attacking you. And this was a really, really intelligent move by Zach here, because his setup ensured that Henry would have to try to go for some kind of either attack on a lower priority target or a parry in order to get that priority back because of the attack that Zachary just did. So you have to think of the sequence this way. Zach comes in with that hand thrust. The reason it's a hand thrust and the reason that hand thrust is important is because you can't really parry it. That parry would have been 100% necessary in order to give Henry the feedback he needed to know that once he had that parry, he could then riposte without fear of getting doubled. But because he didn't get that parry, he had to be very careful when he reasserted his attack. Because he wanted to make sure to be safe when he came back into measure, he wanted to throw a parry. And because you knew that he had to take a step and parry at the same time, Zach can easily dip his blade, put it in a place where it cannot be parried while actively moving forward, and then all he had to do was present his tip forward into this new line and make sure that Henry moved far enough forward to stab himself essentially onto the blade. It's a really great demonstration on how if you know the rules and you know how someone is going to react to certain situations, you can go down the list of options and basically guarantee in a sort of as much a way as you can in a sword fight what your opponent is going to do and capitalize on it. So I promised I wouldn't talk about rule set too much, and I'll try not to here, but this is another situation that comes up a lot in other tournaments that doesn't always resolve in a satisfying way. What happens is Zach comes in with a little bit of a right Zverkow, it gets parried, and then he throws a left Zverkow. Some people would call this the Zverkopter. I don't really agree with that because throwing two Zverkows in a sequence hardly constitutes a helicopter. But at the end of the day, what matters here is that first parry. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Henry is very, very good at moving backwards and parrying and taking advantage of the fact that the rule set will reward you for doing so. And as a result of this particular interaction, because Zach came forward with an attack and that attack got parried, he lost priority, which means that after Henry parried and then reposted, what mattered is the fact that he hit after he parried and he keeps priority while Zach loses it. It doesn't really matter where they land as long as they don't Zverk to the body. And as a result, Henry comes away with a very important point. It's also worth pointing out here that this is the first time that Henry has really been able to stifle the offense of Zach And it shows a bit of a shift in the dynamics of the fight where Henry is starting to pull back on points and really start to even things up. And he did it without doing his classic hand shot maneuver, which means that Zach is going to have to really dig deep in order to find some new options in order to get past the now working and functioning defense of Henry. This adaptation, of course, comes in the next exchange where Zach finds a new spot to engage with Henry that Henry is clearly not as comfortable at. That is the grapple distance. Now, the idea here is that when you come forward and try to attack Henry, he's going to move backwards. So getting into a grapple distance is going to be very, very difficult, especially without getting parry riposted. However, there is a little bit of an option when Henry comes forward. If he's going to come forward, you know he's either going to go for the head or the arms because those are the target priorities where he doesn't lose priority. So what you have to do is you have to step forward and you have to gamble on a parry, but then once you get into that position, you can use whatever knowledge you have of that distance in order to capitalize on some very crucial shots. Now, there are a couple ways this can go right and this can go wrong. When Zach comes forward, he basically feints the fact that he's going to go for his classic left plow thrust. He comes forward in left plow, he extends his point a little bit. And what this tells Henry is that that thrust might be coming down the pipe. However, Henry still decides to go for the attack on the offside, believing that he had attack priority when he started moving forward first. As a result, Zach cannot simply stab Henry in the face. He has to parry, and he does. He takes his point and he short edge deflections off to his right side. But because both of them were moving forward at the same time, they collide and they end up in that classic high bind where everybody's hands are high in the air. However, from this position, you have to be very, very careful. For Henry has to be very, very careful because he knows he got parried on the way in and he probably just lost priority, and now he has to parry a follow-up shot that could theoretically go anywhere. However, Zach also has to be very careful in this interaction because if he zverks too low and hits the body, he can be giving up any kind of double to his opponent. So Zach has to use his grapple knowledge in order to push Henry's hands where they need to be so that he can throw a zverk to the upper area and land it without Henry being able to parry. And this is, again, a great demonstration of the kinds of interactions this rule set can create, because in that sense, Henry was fully able to parry these openings. There is no sense that he couldn't or shouldn't have been able to, because Zach didn't go down all the way to the body or the hip or even sink his legs and go all for the knee or something. He was able to parry, but he just wasn't able to get there in time because Zach chose a very, very precise line, an Untersverk up into the ear that goes underneath of where Henry's parry has to come from. So in this interaction, Zach knows that Henry has to parry, and now he knows exactly what tech he needs to use to get around the parry that he knows is coming. So we're coming towards the end of the fight now, and throughout this entire fight, the fight has been very, very close. Henry has never been more than a few points down, and by this point, the fight was basically tied. So Zach is going to come in with a similar sort of strategy that we saw in the previous exchange. He's going to come in with a big thrust. Only this time, Henry is the one who parries Zach off to the side right as they end up in that high-to-high bind, well, ones where the hands are in the air. As a result, it is now Zach's turn who has to parry. And because Zach has to parry, he has a really tough thing to do here. Henry can either go high and try to get a high priority target, ensuring that he cannot lose priority, or he can choose to go low and hope that Zach's attempt to parry isn't going to come with a double. Henry does choose to go high, and as a result, Zach is able to just barely get his blade in the way and throw a hanging parry that defends that Zverkow. So now that Zach has parried, it is now his turn to throw a follow-up technique, and now Henry is the one in a really, really tough spot. However, something very unique happens here. As Zach goes out of his hanging parry and throws his follow-up technique, he does manage to land it, but he flat slaps it. And the reason he flats it is because of the position that he was in when he went to throw his riposte. That hanging parry is a very, very good parry to do, but when you're trying to throw Zverkows, you often will put your thumb on the bottom of the flat of the blade. As a result, It was Zach's flat that took the blow that Henry threw, and when he pulled out of his hanging parry and then wanted to throw a counterattack, his thumb was still on the back of the blade, which means he didn't actually get any rotation and he didn't get any edge contact on his target, and he ended up throwing a flat hit. And this was a really critical moment because it was a great sequence where Zach demonstrated his dominance in that high bind scenario, but wasn't able to come away with a clean point at a very crucial moment where the fight was almost essentially over. So we come now to the final exchange, and it does not disappoint. Zach comes forward with a little bit of a feinted thrust, and this is a really good idea so far because we know that Henry is always looking for those parry riposts while moving backwards. So when Zach throws that feinted thrust, he kind of flicks it forward, he throws his body forward, but he doesn't overextend his hands or his torso, which means that Henry doesn't really have anything to parry, and most importantly, Zach is still in a defensible position when Henry starts to throw his riposte, which he does. Henry throws a riposte in the form of a Showalter on the left side of his body and on the left side of the line, trying to hit Zach in a position that is a little bit more difficult to guard for a right-handed person. Zach, who has been expecting this the whole time, throws a short edge deflection with his right hand and just barely scoots that counter Showalter off to the side fast enough to not get hit, and then whips around with a counter strike left overhow, a parry riposte of his own, and manages to land it onto the head / arms of Henry, who was unable to get behind his sword fast enough in order to parry the follow-up blow, giving the point to Zach and winning him the match. But there's another important caveat and a little bit of a discussion to have here about what would have happened if Henry had landed that Showalter. Despite the fact that Zach had come forward with a feinted attack and Henry never got a real parry off of that initial, if Henry had managed to land that follow-up Showalter, he absolutely would have come away with the point, not just because he was the one with attack priority, but because when you go to try to parry, you are by definition not attacking, which means you lose attack priority. So despite the fact that Zach was still moving forward at the time when he went for his right side short edge deflection, if he had failed that parry, Henry would have gotten the point and possibly tied it up or even gotten the win. And the idea here is that if you're looking at rule sets, this is the kind of interaction, again, where you love how the rule set judges these interactions. You want situations where people have to meaningfully defend themselves in situations where they have to meaningfully defend themselves and are punished if they don't do so. Zach had basically no choice but to go for that parry, and Henry had every opportunity to land that Showalter and come away with the point. At the exact same time, though, once Zach got that parry, he was in the dominant position, and Henry had no choice but to try to throw everything he had at that follow-up parry, and it's because of the position he was in when he threw the Showalter that he was unable to make it there in time. These are some really great interactions, some really great fencing from both people, and I can't help but give just a little bit of credit to the rule set here for putting both of these fencers in a position where, one, they could fence over and over and over again and have a meaningful resolution to almost every single exchange, and to put them in situations where they had to defend, and sometimes in situations where they had to attack, and they would be rewarded based on the places that they hit, whether or not they had their edge aligned, and most importantly, whether or not they were fencing cleanly. And again, I can't help but point out that if you are looking for a rule set that emphasizes all of these things, maybe you've been looking at right of way in the wrong light this entire time. But that's going to be it for today. If you'd like to see more stuff, I will be back on Thursday with another review and another bit of footage where somebody split the camera down the middle and I had to zoom in inappropriately at the back of some judge. So I'll see you next time.